everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Sarah Labaton. I'm the Director of Teaching and Learning at the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America. We at the Shalom Hartman Institute are so gratified to be partnering with our friends at Central Synagogue to offer classes taught by leading Jewish thinkers on the urgent issues of the moment. We are facing profoundly challenging and even despairing times, and it's really critical that we have teachers and scholars to offer ideas and frameworks for navigating the crisis that the many crises that we're finding ourselves in. I wanted to open up by offering people in the room to dedicate their learning in memory or in honor of somebody. Feel free to put the name of somebody who you're thinking about in the chat. I personally am thinking about Rabbi David Ellenson, who passed away last week. And I'm also thinking about the many soldiers of the IDF who have lost their lives over the last few weeks. We will have time at the end for questions. Please feel free to put your questions either in the chat, or you can also private message them to me, and I will be bringing them to Yossi at the end of the session. To introduce Yossi, I'm going to turn it over to Rabbi Joy Levitt. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody, and thanks for joining us. And thanks, as always, to our wonderful partners at the Shalom Hartman Institute, both of North America and particularly today in Yerushalayim. I'm the Director of Adult Engagement here at Central Synagogue, and it's great to see so many faces, new and old. Our dear friend, Yossi Klein Halevi, no stranger to Central Synagogue, is a senior fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute of Jerusalem, together with Imam Abdullah Antepli of Duke University. He co-directs the Institute's Muslim Leadership Initiative, otherwise known as MLI, which teaches emerging young Muslim American leaders about Judaism, Jewish identity, and Israel. Yossi's book, Like Dreamers, won the Jewish Book Council's Everett Book of the Year award. I would really encourage you to read it. It's a beautiful, beautiful book, as is his latest book, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, a New York Times bestseller. With that, I'm going to turn it over to our teacher, our friend, Yossi Klein Halevi. And first, know that we are sending all our love and all our sense of Jewish peoplehood to you, to your family, to Yerushalayim, to all of Israel. Central feels very deeply the connection between our two communities, and particularly now.
Thanks so much, Joy, and wonderful to be back with you, and good to be with all of you. What I would like to do today is offer a window into a really unique moment in the history of the Israeli psyche, and to try to unpack what is happening in Israel, how Israelis are seeing this. And this is one of the very few moments that I can recall where we can really speak about a unified Israeli psyche, because Israeli society is more cohesive today than I think it has been, certainly since the early 2000s, the years of the Second Intifada and the suicide bombings, but perhaps even further back to the Yom Kippur War in 1973. I think this is really a peak moment. And I'll have more to say about that experience of unity in a few minutes. Just would like to greet my friend Barbara Johnson. It's wonderful to see your picture, and hope to see you live. So the place really, I think, to begin in unpacking this Israeli moment is how Israelis understand what this war is about. And I would define this, the goal of this war is the restoration of two forms of Israeli credibility, which were shattered on October 7th. One concerns our relations to the region, and the other concerns our relations internally, the covenant between the state and its citizens, and more broadly, the covenant between Zionism and the Jewish people. And so the first shattering that happened on October 7th was the destruction of Israel's military credibility. The fact that our weakest enemy, which was Hamas, at least in our perception, delivered the single most devastating blow in Israel's history, meant that our military credibility was not only challenged, but destroyed. That was the reality to which we awakened on October 7th. About 15 years ago, the head of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah, made a speech in which he explained how he envisioned the eventual destruction of Israel. And he used a metaphor which has since haunted many of us in Israel. And he compared Israel to a spider web. And he said that just as a spider web appears from without to be impenetrable, with a single swipe, the spider web disintegrates. And that's what happened to us on October 7th. Hamas tested the spider web theory and proved that it was true. Not only did the army fail to, in the most minimal way, protect the border, but it failed for long hours to even respond adequately. We glimpsed a possible scenario of what the destruction of Israel would look like. Our border overrun, the Israeli army nowhere to be seen, citizens abandoned, and really the collapse of Israeli sovereignty. And so for me, this is the spiderweb war. This is the war that we're fighting to prove to our enemies in the region that we are not, in fact, on the decline, and we still have the capability to adequately defend ourselves. The goal of Hamas on October 7th was to terrorize and create despair. And that's why the means of the October 7th massacre were also the ends. This was not a terrorist attack in which atrocities happened incidentally or in the heat of battle. The atrocities, the mutilations, severing of limbs, the rapes, this was all in the Hamas manual that the terrorists received before they set out to the border. And the purpose of this mass atrocity was to convey the message to Israelis that we have no future in this land and that we're facing an enemy that is so determined and capable of absolutely anything that really all we can do to save our children is to take them out of here. The perception of Israel as in military decline, serious military decline, is a tremendous challenge to our ability to defend ourselves in this region. The message to the enemies on our border of October 7th is that it is now reasonably safe to commit additional incursions into Israel. And for that reason, I would say that most Israelis, to one extent or another, define this war as existential. Now, by existential, I don't mean that if Israel fails to destroy Hamas, if we don't succeed in dislodging this genocidal regime on our border, we are not going to be in imminent danger of destruction. The existential threat is not immediate. It's more gradual, long-term. It will be the sense among the Israeli public that we no longer really have the ability to deal with our enemies, certainly not the way we used to. And even as our self-confidence declines, the self-confidence of our enemies will rise. And so the existential threat is more subtle. It's not a Yom Kippur War or a 1967 version of existential threat. It's more long-term, it's more gradual, but many of us here, maybe most Israelis, have this deep intuition that this is one of those moments in the life of Israel that really will determine our long-term ability to survive in the Middle East. Now, the second form of Israel's credibility that was destroyed on October 7th was the Zionist promise of creating a safe refuge for the Jewish people. The covenant between the state of Israel and the Jewish people was destroyed on October 7th. Israel today is by far the most dangerous place in the world to be a Jew. There is nowhere else in the world where one can conceive of 1,200 Jews being murdered, mutilated in a state of helplessness, except in the state of Israel. There's nowhere else where one can imagine an anti-Semitic regime kidnapping 240 Jews and effectively holding them for ransom, except here, except in Israel. And so, if you think about what the Israeli ethos has been all these years, it's really represented by the Entebbe rescue of 1976, when Israel sent commandos halfway across Africa to rescue 100 Israelis who were held hostage by hijackers in Entebbe airport in Uganda. This was the anti-Entebbe. You had a very large number of Jews who died in a state of their hands were bound behind their backs. They were burned alive within the sovereign borders of the state. And this is the shock that we in Israel haven't begun to absorb. That the worst blow, the worst return of Jewish helplessness happened within Israel's sovereign borders. And so this is also a war to restore the credibility of Israel's promise of refuge. And it is in the same way that restoring our military credibility is a war against the perception of the spiderweb. This is a war against the perception of the return of Jewish victimhood. The essence of the Israeli ethos was that we are no longer victims. October 7th was a reversal of that ethos. And as a result, we are now in a desperate attempt to reclaim the credibility of the Zionists. Now, this is a moment where we find ourselves in radical dissonance with much of the rest of the world. I mentioned earlier that Israeli society has not been this united, perhaps since the Yom Kippur War. A poll taken just last week showed that 90% of Jewish Israelis not only support the war, but want the war to continue until Hamas is destroyed. Now, bear in mind that 90% of Israelis don't agree on anything. And we're just coming out of the most divisive year in Israel's history. I was out on the streets with hundreds of thousands of Israelis literally every week, protesting against this government, sometimes 2 or 3 times a week. And to pivot from the lowest point of our national cohesiveness, and I think this year really was, in some ways, the most divisive moment we've had, certainly since the Rabin assassination, and maybe in some senses even more profound. And to immediately pivot from October 6th to the unity of October 8th is something which, if you would have asked me 2 months ago, 3 months ago, was it possible? I wouldn't have believed it. In previous wars, especially asymmetrical wars, which we've been fighting since the first Lebanon War of 1982, every one of Israel's wars has been asymmetrical, a conventional army against terrorists embedded in a civilian population. Every one of those wars generated, to one extent or another, a strong protest movement to stop the war. And in those cases, there was nowhere near the devastation and the loss of life and the misery that we're inflicting now in Gaza. And yet, 90+% of Jewish Israelis believe we need to not only continue the war, but not allow anything to stand in the way of defeating, destroying the Hamas regime. I was on a panel last week with 2 other Israeli writers. It was sponsored by PEN, the writers group. And my two fellow panelists were people who were quite left-wing, certainly well to the left of where I sit. And yet there was no disagreement among us about the goals of this war. And I was thinking about how if my 2 fellow panelists had not been Israeli, but had been American Jews, they would most likely be calling for a ceasefire now. So there's something in the ways in which we're experiencing this war, the different ways, that I think is really worth noting. And one can really filter the differences through the Israeli left and the American Jewish left, and what is preoccupying the Israeli left and what is preoccupying the American Jewish left. Now, the only possible way that I can see that can begin to break is this unity apart, this unity within Israeli society, is if it becomes increasingly clear that continuing the war will endanger the lives of the hostages. And if there is an offer on the table that in exchange for stopping the war, Hamas will release all the remaining hostages, this will present an unbearable dilemma for many of us. And the reason for that is that it will pit 2 essential Israeli values against each other. On the one hand, there's the value of pidyon, what we call pidyon shvuyim, the redemption of prisoners, which is one of those deep exilic Jewish values that were imported into the Israeli ethos. And the commitment to redeem the prisoners is non-negotiable. And that has always been the definition of what makes us a family, what makes us not only a people, but a family. And that is the commitment to do everything we can to free hostages. Now, that's one non-negotiable Israeli value. The second is self-defense, is which would be translated in this case into a commitment to ensure that the regime that did that to the Jewish people will not be allowed to stand. And how these two non-negotiable values play out, if they're posited against each other, is going to be could be a very deep divide here. And the question that I think many Israelis will ask themselves is, breaking which of these two values will cause greater harm to Israeli society? If we fail to bring home all of the hostages, that will be interpreted by many Israelis as a violation of the covenant of the state with the people of Israel. And it could seriously impact on the way many Israelis feel in terms of their reciprocal commitment to protecting the state. On the other hand, many other Israelis will feel that if we don't fulfill our pledge to destroy this regime, then we have failed in the most basic Zionist promise to teach the Jews how to defend themselves. So that's beyond the political issue. This will go to the heart of who we are as a people. Now, how does the Israeli public relate to the question of Palestinian civilian casualties? The truth is, there's very little conversation here, certainly not in the public sphere, and I would guess not in the private sphere either. There's very little angst among Israelis. There are all kinds of reasons for that, which I'd like to briefly unpack. And these are reasons and not justifications. And the first is that if this is a just war, if this is an existential war, and again, I believe that almost every Israeli Jew believes that this war is both just and existentially necessary, then we have no choice but to see this through. The question then is, even given that almost everyone here accepts that this is a just war and an essential war, the question still remains, why is there so little debate over the question of how does one fight a just war? And here I think there are several reasons. One is that we know the army. The army is us. The army is, for Israelis, is an open book. And we know that we can basically trust the army to, at the very least, not target civilians. That, I think, is a given for virtually all Israeli Jews. And if you'll notice, I keep saying Israeli Jews because the situation among Israeli Arabs is different. And we need to keep that in mind. That's 20% of the population. At the same time, there's tremendous rage among Israelis, which I don't see abating. I know, I'm looking at myself. I keep learning new facets of what happened to us on October 7th. The rest of the world has moved on, but we are still in October 7th. We're still unpacking what happened. And one friend of mine who's quite prominent on the Israeli left said to me that he's having a very great difficulty controlling his rage against the Palestinians. And he has to keep reminding himself of the enormous suffering that civilians are going through, and to remind himself to care. And then he said, well, if I'm experiencing this, if this is what I'm going through, you can imagine what the average Israeli is thinking and feeling. Another element here is that we are a society that over the last decades has become increasingly sensitive to fallen soldiers. We don't handle our military casualties well. And that's been growing. That trend has been growing in Israeli society, I think really since 1973. The old Israeli stoicism, which was really motivated by the sense that we have no choice and we just need to bite our lip and persevere, that was weakening in Israeli society. It's back now. October 7th brought it back. And what you see at the military funerals and in the Shiva of the fallen soldiers is this extraordinary sense of pride. The families are proud of their children who have fallen and are taking comfort that their children died in protection of Israel. And that's a tone that we haven't really heard that much in Israel in recent decades. So October 7th, I think it was really also the mass death by helplessness of so many Israelis that has reframed the question of military casualties. We now know there's something worse than young soldiers dying in battle, and that is Israeli civilians dying without a gun, without the ability to defend themselves. So these are all elements that I think are playing out either consciously or implicitly in the Israeli psyche. And it is creating a situation where the discourse here is very different than the discourse in American Jewry. And we're going to have to figure out what to do about that if we're going to really try to speak to each other. Now, what has changed, I mentioned earlier that Israelis trust the army. That has not changed. But what has changed is that the rules of engagement in Gaza are different this time around. In the past, there was the famous knock on the roof to alert people to leave. Well, this time we gave notice to civilians to evacuate northern Gaza, and we were engaged in a military buildup, and so there was time for civilians to leave. And so Israelis at this point really feel, well, we gave them enough notice. But we all know that many civilians did not leave the north. And what has changed in terms of the rules of military engagement, I'll give you an example. In the past, if we would have intelligence that a Hamas leader was spotted, let's say, in a car with his family, there would be a serious deliberation about whether the Hamas leader should be assassinated, given that it would mean killing his family as well. And there were times when Israel decided not to pursue that. And there were times when the decision was made to assassinate. And generally, the consideration was, does that particular individual pose an immediate danger to Israelis? Today, my strong sense is, I haven't heard this confirmed, but it is my sense, is that if a Hamas leader, military or political, is spotted together with family, there will not be a big deliberation. The decision will be made to take him out. Today, the army doesn't hesitate to go into mosques. We've destroyed at least one mosque that I know of. We don't hesitate, as you all know, to go into hospitals. And the message there is that Hamas will no longer enjoy immunity. And if you make the decision to destroy the Hamas regime, then the rules of engagement necessarily need to change. The justification that I've heard for this change in policy from someone who is a senior legal advisor to the government, and his argument was really using international law and the Israeli interpretation of international law and proportionality under international law is that proportionality is measured by the threat that you face and by your military goal. And so given the fact that we perceive this threat as existential, that we're facing a regime that has already proven its seriousness in committing many acts of genocide, we regard the change in the rules of engagement as proportional. I'd like to briefly go through what the morning after might look like. First of all, in terms of Israeli society internally, and then looking at some other issues. I have to say that I am far more hopeful about Israel after October 7th than I was before. And I know that that might sound a little counterintuitive. But I had mentioned earlier that if you'd asked me, would I believe that it would be possible for Israelis to ever come together again in a state of national unity, I'm not sure I would have answered yes. And so what we learned on October 8th was that we still have the capacity to function as a people. And given the extraordinary bitterness of the last year, where it really felt like we were losing our ability to feel the most minimal sense of commonality with the rival camp, whatever your rival camp was. The restoration, however temporary, of our national unity has been a very positive shock to the Israeli system. And you hear it across the political spectrum. And there is this determination that when the war ends and we inevitably go back to our debates, our bitter debates, that we need to conduct them in a different way. The divides are not going away. The day after the war, the protest movement against Netanyahu will resume, but with a ferocity and a determination that we've never seen in the history of Israeli protest movements. We will shut this country down if necessary, and I think it will be necessary. We will not allow this government one moment of peace. This government must be brought to But most of us believe that it's politically unwise to resume the protests before the war ends for the simple reason, and that is that many Israelis on the moderate right who today sympathize with us might drift away because they would be very angry to see demonstrations against the government during the war. And so we have to be very careful to respect the red lines in this society. Politically, I feel that there are opposing trends that will play out after the war here. On the one hand, inevitably, there's going to be a rise in the power of the far right. This event, October 7th, is the formative experience for this younger generation of Israelis. This is their Israeli moment. And the temptation of moving farther right, I think, will be very strong. At the same time, what the polls consistently show is that a majority, even a strong majority of Israelis, are likely to vote center-right. Benny Gantz will probably be the next prime minister. Polls show him getting, his coalition getting up to 70 seats. I've seen one poll that includes Mansour Abbas bringing in 75 seats. And so the Bennett-Lapid coalition, at least according to the polls at this moment, and one always has to emphasize in Israel at this moment, because this is one of the most fluid realities anywhere, not just during war, but in general. My sense is that a majority of Israelis are hungry for stability. They want to cool down the political pressures here. It will be the center-right that will be the great beneficiary of that. What does the morning look like, the morning after look like for Gaza and the Palestinians? My hope is, and I know it is a forlorn hope, but nevertheless, I've been trying to put it out there. That is that the nations of the Abraham Accords, together with the Saudis, adopt Gaza as the first regional project for the Abraham Accords. And first of all, economic development, and then political development, and joint security measures. That's my hope. That will depend on a new Israeli government. This Israeli government is not a partner for any regional change. In terms of the Israeli public's attitudes toward the Palestinians, excuse me, at this moment, it's inconceivable for almost everyone to imagine a Palestinian state in the West Bank. That has been wiped out of Israeli consciousness, at least for now. The question is, if not the day after, maybe 2 or 3 days after the day after, will Israelis look at October 7th and say, well, this proves that we can never have a Palestinian state because we can't risk duplicating Gaza in the West Bank, which is our most sensitive border. And that's a very compelling argument, even for people like me who support a two-state solution in principle. It's a very powerful argument. On the other hand, there's a counter-argument that also comes out of October 7th, which is we can't live in one state with Gaza and the West Bank, whether that is the one state envisioned by the anti-Zionist left or the hyper-Zionist right. We cannot live in a one-state solution is the road to self-destruction. And so I think that if that message sinks in to the Israeli public, then we could be looking at the resurrection of the old idea that Yitzhak Rabin promoted of separation between Palestinians and Israelis. Shimon Peres spoke about peace. Rabin spoke about separation. I think before we can speak about peace, we may need to resurrect the idea of separation. My long-term hope for resolving the Palestinian tragedy would be in the context of a regional peace agreement. A regional problem requires a regional solution. The way that this conflict is generally perceived abroad is as a war between Israel and Hamas or Israel and the Palestinians. That's not how Israelis understand this war. We see this as a war with one of Iran's proxies. That war may spread to other proxies, to Hezbollah, to Syria, to the Houthis, perhaps a direct confrontation with Iran itself. This has never been only an Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It was always a regional conflict. In the past, it was a regional conflict between the Sunni world and Israel. Today, it is largely a regional conflict between the Shiites and Israel. But it is still experienced in Israel as a regional conflict. And so as a result of that, we perceive this war in Hamas in very different terms. This is not just the Palestinian David against the Israeli Goliath. This is a far more vulnerable Israel if you widen the lens and extend the conflict to its natural dimensions, which are regional and not just bilateral. The morning after, in terms of relations between American Jews and Israel, and I'll wrap up with this and we'll open for conversation. This is a precious moment in our relationship. We're paying attention to each other again. And maybe in some ways, even for the first time in many decades. And I think the reason for that is that we are both experiencing variations of vulnerability simultaneously. We have never been vulnerable together. American Jews have never felt as vulnerable as they do now, probably not since the 1930s, the American 1930s. And in that sense, what both Israel and American Jewry discovered on October 8th was that neither is as strong and secure as we believed. And that, I believe, creates an opening for us to have a different kind of conversation, to do a reset in the American Jewish-Israeli relationship. And the starting point for me of what a reset would look like is that we all need to ask ourselves, Israelis and American Jews, a really hard question, which is how did we allow ourselves to get to the point where the two centers of the Jewish people were seriously talking about a divorce? How did we, given the tremendous outpouring of concern and love for Israel that we've seen happening among American Jews, which I think has surprised many American Jews themselves, how did we allow ourselves to imagine that this relationship could simply disappear? So sharing vulnerability is not enough of a basis for a healthy relationship. What we need to do is not only conceive of new ways of relating to each other politically, and we will need to reconceive what it means to be a loving critic in relationship to Israel and how Israel needs to accommodate that. That's on our side. On the American Jewish side, I think that left-wing American Jews need to rethink their assumptions about Israeli power and Israeli invulnerability, and need to begin understanding why the Israeli public has been so afraid of creating a Palestinian state on the West Bank. There are new terms of the political conversation between us, but the conversation must go deeper. We need to start looking at the Jewish lives that we've created in both societies, because we know very, very little about each other's inner worlds. We know very little about Israelis know very little to actually nothing about American Jewish religious pluralism. American Jews know very little about Israeli culture, Israeli music. It's this fantastic treasure that we've created, this Hebrew culture. And so I think we do have an historic opportunity for a reset, but we need to take advantage of that and start really doing some hard work. So let's open for conversation.
Thanks so much, Yossi. We've gotten a lot of really substantive and important questions in the chat. One of the questions has to do with the covenant. Was there a covenant that was broken on October 7th between the Israeli government and Israelis or Israeli Jews? And you spoke about the unity and how from October 6th to October 7th, there was a transformation from divisiveness to unity. But where have those fractures gone? Are any of the fractures from the protest movement playing out in the context of the war?
Yeah, good question. Both good questions. The covenant between the state and the people was broken on October 7th, between the state and the army, between the people and the army. And so if we don't defeat Hamas, that broken covenant is going to become more acute. The trust of the Israeli public in our institutions and our ability to defend ourselves is going to really be serious. What the war in Gaza has done is defer that crisis, but it has not resolved it. It will only be resolved if we destroy Hamas. And I need to take a moment to write that point down because it's really important. So thank you for the inspiration. And in terms of the second question, there is a debate in the protest movement about whether to resurrect the demonstrations. Last week saw the first big demonstration by the war standards. It was not at all a big demonstration by the standards of the last year, but it was the first demonstration that really brought out thousands of people demanding that Netanyahu resign now. The polls show that 80% of the public want Netanyahu to go. About 37% want him to resign immediately, the rest after the war. Now, I would want Netanyahu to resign today, but given where much of the Israeli public is at, as I mentioned earlier, I don't think it's a wise move for us to renew the protests. It would be premature and perhaps play into Netanyahu's hands. He'd be able to accuse us of a lack of patriotism, which is his forte. The debate about do we place destroying Hamas as the number one goal of the war, or is it retrieving the hostages? My sense is that that cuts across political lines, though people on the right would tend more to the hard line, to saying we need to prioritize the war, but not only people on the right. I think it's really important to emphasize that isn't only a right-wing position here. And there is a little bit of both positions in everybody. It's a question of how you prioritize. And so it doesn't neatly fall along those lines.
There are a bunch of questions around what is happening now in North America, especially on college campuses, and some curiosity around how Israelis, number one, are perceiving the crises that is engulfing North American Jewry at the moment, some of the internal crises, some of the North American Jewish politics, and the fights between the far left of the American Jewish community and the mainstream Jewish establishment, and also whether there is anything that North American Jews can do to support Israel beyond the outpouring of financial support and beyond showing up for Israel. Is there anything that you're seeing in the North American Jewish discourse that Israelis would do well to listen to and absorb?
A lot of questions in one there, Sarah. The Israeli public has very little attention span for anything outside of the war. But to a remarkable degree, people are paying attention to what's happening in the diaspora generally, but especially in America. Israelis in the last year or two finally absorbed the fact that we are in a crisis in our relationship with American Jewry. And, you know, we often speak about a diaspora Israel crisis. There is no diaspora Israel crisis. It's an American Jewish Israeli crisis. The rest of the diaspora, even if it wavers in its conviction that Israel is always right, nevertheless is emotionally so deeply aligned with Israel. That's true for Europe, European Jewry. It's true for Latin America. It's true for the more vulnerable Jewish communities. It's also still to a large extent true in Canada and very true in Australia and South Africa. So the crisis was really American Jewry in Israel, and it was 70% of American Jewry. It was the 70% that is liberal and or progressive. And so Israelis are very aware of the anti-Zionist Jewish demonstrations, but the Washington demonstration was a very big deal here, and it was experienced by Israelis as a kind of relief, a reassurance. And Israelis are, I think, to some extent, for the most part, not in a very sophisticated way, but are following what's happening with American Jewry. And again, when I say not sophisticated, it's are they for us or are they not for us? You know, it's kind of on that level. They're not aware of the nuances. I mean, so, you know, for me, I was very struck by the fact that J Street and even Trua did not call for a ceasefire, and both showed up in Washington. And just as an aside, I think that this is a moment where we can really draw new communal lines. And that is anyone who was at the Washington demonstration belongs to the community, regardless, even if J Street wavers now and starts calling for a ceasefire. I think something very significant happened. And that's especially important for the Jewish right to understand. I think people in Central don't need to be convinced of this, nor do people at Hartman. But the Israeli right and the American Jewish right both need to understand that this was a watershed. So in terms of the Israeli public, I would say that we need to make that argument to Israelis that the support for Israel is much broader and maybe deeper than we thought. In terms of what can be done for Israel, beyond what is being done. Over this past year, I devoted much of my time to trying to get American Jews to actively support the democracy movement. And I'm mentioning that because it was a very hard sell. And it was a hard sell because the democracy movement is not left-wing. It's centrist. The symbol of the democracy movement was the Israeli flag. You would not have a liberal protest movement in America with thousands of big American flags. And so there was something that didn't naturally translate to liberal American Jews about what we were doing. And what we were saying was, this is a moment to affirm your love of Israel. This is a patriotic movement of opposition to the government, but it's opposition in an Israeli way, not in what we've seen in the West. And for various reasons, I felt that American Jews were having a hard time expressing love for Israel that's also criticism. You either criticize or you love. And the democracy movement was an opportunity to bring those two together. And I'm mentioning that not because it's relevant at the moment, it isn't, but it's an example of how we can begin to reconfigure even the language that we use, the way we speak to each other. And so those are some of the more long-term ideas in terms of supporting Israel in the middle of the war. Look, we're in a life and death situation. It's past the ammunition, and that's really where we are. I would add in that context, I would make an appeal, having now said a nice word about J Street and Trua. Let me say a nice word about AIPAC, which is, I believe that this war has vindicated AIPAC. And it's vindicated AIPAC in the sense that what AIPAC has been telling us, and I was very frustrated with AIPAC over the last year because of its refusal to get involved in the democracy movement. I was very angry. And I know that American Jews were understandably angry at AIPAC for supporting Republican candidates who were election deniers. And what I feel, though, is that AIPAC's essential argument, which is that there needs to be an organization that has only one obsessive issue, which is making sure that Congress remains on Israel's side and that the ammunition keeps flowing for the next war. This war vindicated that. And AIPAC is an existential need for the Jewish people. If AIPAC, if American Jews begin to dismantle AIPAC, begin walking away from AIPAC, which is happening, there's not going to be a new AIPAC. There's no replacement for AIPAC. There's only one. And you either own your power or you forfeit it. And I hope that this will be a moment where American Jews who once were liberal American Jews, who once were aligned with AIPAC, will reconsider.
Yossi, thank you so much. I just wanted to know, we couldn't get to all the questions. There are so many wonderful questions in the chat, and I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them, but please continue to tune in to hear Yossi and Daniel on their podcast, For Heaven's Sake. And I know that there are more learning opportunities to come with Central Synagogue.
So I want to thank everybody for joining us, and Yossi, we have a lot more to talk to you about. That was a very provocative way to end this session.
That was a neat trick, wasn't it?
Duly noted, not fair, but duly noted. So I think it's actually would be fascinating to have a conversation with you and others about that, while acknowledging that the magnificence of President Biden's steadfast connection to Israel probably has more to do with his own biography and relationship to the state than anything else. Please stay tuned next week at this time for Dr. Ilana Stein-Hain, who we unfortunately had to postponed from last week because she wasn't well. We'll see her next week at the same time. Again, I want to thank the Hartman Institute for its continuing partnership